Jasmine Crockett shatters the silence in Congress with a single sentence that leaves Kash Patel speechless and the entire room stunned. What she reveals next will shake Washington to its core. Stay to the end to uncover the shocking truth hidden in Patel's secret memo, and the defiant stand that could change American politics forever. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment to share your thoughts on this powerful story of truth, courage, and accountability. You could feel the shift in the room before she even opened her mouth. It was a Wednesday afternoon inside a windowless Capitol Hill committee room, the kind that hums with the antiseptic murmur of democracy grinding through procedure. The air was dry, the lighting harsh, and the atmosphere tense. The hearing had dragged for hours already, but the crowd, staffers, interns, journalists, and a few stunned members of the public had begun to realize they were watching something different now. A storm was circling, and its eye was a calm, composed congresswoman from Texas, Jasmine Crockett. She sat upright, still, scanning the table before her where Kash Patel, former Trump administration official, self-anointed national security expert, and recently emboldened far-right media darling, had just finished another monologue laced with a kind of smug, performative deflection that plays well on conservative cable. He had dismissed a line of questioning about January 6th with a half-smirk and a dig at woke Democrats, eliciting a chuckle from Congressman Biggs to his left and an audible eye roll from one of the committee aides behind him. But then, Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone. She hadn't spoken much throughout the earlier part of the hearing. Unlike some of her colleagues who jockeyed for sound bites, she had sat silently, taking notes. Watching, listening, her restraint had been strategic. And now, as her time began, her voice cut through the static with razor clarity. "Mr. Patel," she said, her tone measured but resolute, "I have just one question to begin with. When exactly did lying to Congress become a patriotic act?" It wasn't the volume of her voice that startled the room. It was the precision. The hearing fell into that rare silence where even the faint buzz of phones being silenced felt intrusive. Kash Patel blinked, opened his mouth, closed it, looked down, then back up. "I'm sorry, Congresswoman. Could you repeat the—" But she didn't need to. The damage was done. The question wasn't a jab. It was a scalpel, because in a single sentence, Crockett had done what hours of procedural grilling had failed to do. She reframed the entire proceeding. No longer was Patel simply another partisan witness being questioned on the technicalities of executive privilege. No longer was this hearing a circus of rehearsed deflections and grandstanding. She had made it personal, about integrity, about truth, about the very marrow of the democratic process. Let me take you behind the moment, because to understand how we got to that question, how it cracked open the carefully constructed armor of a former intelligence operative turned political operative, we have to understand the game that was being played long before Crockett ever took the mic. It starts, in many ways, not with Patel, not even with January 6th, but with a pattern, one that's been playing out in the shadow of American power for years. A pattern of weaponized credentials, of turning government service into ideological performance, of truth being bent, not broken outright, but subtly warped, by those who understood the architecture of accountability, but had learned how to dance just outside its reach. Kash Patel, a man who once served as chief of staff to the acting Secretary of Defense in the final days of the Trump administration, had become a kind of mythological figure in MAGA circles. Not a general, not a policymaker, but a knight of deep state defiance. He was the man who helped rewrite intelligence assessments, the man who made declassification a political weapon, the man who repeatedly inserted himself into investigations not as a neutral party, but as a participant with a clear agenda. He had become an avatar for a certain kind of truth denialism, slick, credentialed, and coded in just enough legal ambiguity to stay out of direct indictment. And here he was again, summoned before Congress to testify on the role he may, or may not, have played in the final weeks leading up to the Capitol insurrection. His defenders called it a witch hunt. His critics called it obstruction. But through it all, he sat calm, confident, knowing that the burden of proof was a high bar, and that playing coy with the facts was easier than outright lying. But what he hadn't accounted for was Jasmine Crockett, a freshman Democrat, criminal defense attorney by trade, and relentless advocate for the rule of law. Crockett had risen quickly not by playing the cable news game, but by mastering the courtroom rhythm of cross-examination. Where others shouted, she watched. Where others barked, she asked. She came not to perform, but to expose. Her preparation had been meticulous. Her team had tracked Patel's past testimonies, his podcast appearances, his statements to the press. Every inconsistency cataloged, every deflection noted. They weren't trying to catch him in one explosive lie. They were painting a portrait, a slow, damning mosaic of contradictions. And now, with that single question. When exactly did lying to Congress become a patriotic act? She had turned the entire mosaic into a mirror. In that moment, Kash Patel had two choices: deny it and risk being confronted with the specific lies she'd prepared, or challenge the premise and look like he was parsing semantics while evading accountability. He tried the latter. I think your characterization of my testimony is misinformed, Congresswoman, he said, shifting in his seat. Everything I've said today is under oath and consistent with the law. Crockett didn't blink. That's not what I asked. I asked when lying became a patriotic act. Not if you think you're lying. She paused. Let the silence grow. You've said under oath today that you weren't aware of any unusual orders issued from the Pentagon in the days before January 6th. That you were acting purely in service of national security. That you had no role in shaping the response to the Capitol attack. Is that correct? Yes, Patel answered quickly, like a man confident in a script. Crockett tapped her pen. So you weren't in the room when Acting Secretary Miller was coordinating troop deployments with President Trump? I was present at some discussions, yes. Were you advising? I can't comment on classified matters. Mr. Patel, she said, her voice gaining weight. You just told this committee under oath that you weren't involved. Now you say you were present at discussions. Which is it? Another silence. Longer now. This is the part where the audience, both in the room and across the country, watching the live feed, began to realize this wasn't a routine hearing anymore. It was a reckoning, not just with Patel, but with a pattern of deliberate obfuscation that had long gone unpunished. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to posture. She was here to hold up the truth like a torch in a cave full of shadows. She flipped a page in her binder. Because I have a transcript here, verified, where you referred to that same conversation as one in which you offered strategic advice on the timing of National Guard deployment. Would you like to revise your statement, or should we enter this into the record? Patel's jaw tightened. Behind him, one of his lawyers leaned forward, whispering something. Crockett let the tension hang. The truth is, hearings like this rarely change minds. They're procedural, often theater. But occasionally, someone disrupts the pattern. Someone brings clarity not by shouting louder, but by asking the question no one else dared ask. That's what Crockett had done, and she wasn't finished yet. As her time ticked down, she looked up once more and asked the question that would go viral before the day was out. The question that would ricochet across newsrooms, dominate panel discussions, and resurface in campaign ads for years to come. But that sentence, the one that destroyed Patel, that stunned the room and reframed the entire narrative, would come not as a crescendo, but as a quiet coda. Just before the gavel came down, she said it. What followed wasn't an outburst. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't shouted to dominate headlines or choreographed for social media. It was quieter than that. So quiet, in fact, that some people in the room didn't even process the gravity of it until the silence after it had fallen. Jasmine Crockett, still seated upright and steady, leaned just slightly closer to the mic and said, "You keep calling it patriotism, Mr. Patel, but to most Americans, it looks a lot like treason wrapped in a press release." That was it. That was the sentence. No crescendo, no finger-pointing, just a single surgically delivered line that stopped time in a Capitol hearing room. One of those rare political moments that doesn't just trend, but imprints. The kind of sentence that echoes long after it's spoken, because it cuts to something fundamental and undeniable. That this nation has been gaslit for years, and people are starting to call the bluff. Across the dais, even Patel's most loyal defenders blinked. Congressman Biggs looked away. Marjorie Taylor Greene shifted in her seat. The murmur of side chatter stopped entirely, and one of the aides behind Crockett reached for a pen and wrote the line down on their legal pad in all caps. Treason wrapped in a press release. No matter what side of the aisle you were on, everyone knew the hearing had just changed. Patel's eyes narrowed. His mouth twitched in a smirk that was more reflex than defense. He leaned toward his mic as if to counter, but his legal counsel placed a firm hand on his forearm. "Not now," the gesture said. "Not this. Not her." And there was good reason to hesitate. Jasmine Crockett wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't bluffing. She had spent her career, first as a public defender, then as a civil rights attorney, honing a skill most politicians only perform. The ability to corner someone with the truth and leave them with no path out except through it. She understood the gravity of words because she had lived their consequences in courtrooms where justice was not abstract. And Kash Patel, for all his bravado, knew what that meant. He knew that her statement wasn't just rhetorical flair. It was a thesis, a declaration that there would be no more free rides on the fumes of plausible deniability, that the comfort zone of media circuits and partisan echo chambers would no longer shield the architects of misinformation from real scrutiny. But this story, like every meaningful political confrontation, wasn't just about the characters in the room. It was about the stories behind them, the stakes beneath the statements. And to grasp the full impact of Crockett's sentence, we need to understand what was at stake not just for Patel, but for a nation teetering between accountability and collapse. Let's rewind for a moment. In the months following the January 6th insurrection, the narrative war had been relentless. Some saw a violent attempt to overturn the democratic process. Others insisted it was a protest gone too far. But within that haze of reinterpretation, one figure had emerged as particularly elusive: Kash Patel. He wasn't caught breaking windows or giving inflammatory speeches. He wasn't in the headlines, but he was in the rooms, in the Pentagon, in the West Wing, in the classified meetings where deployment timelines were discussed and communications were shaped. He knew things, and more importantly, he helped shape the things we were allowed to know. He had crafted statements that downplayed the chaos. He had testified in past settings with careful denials that danced on the edge of perjury. He had cultivated a public persona that framed his actions as defense of national order, even when the order he defended was crumbling under the weight of falsehoods. And now, he was being asked, no forced, to account for the dissonance between what he claimed and what the record showed. That's why Crockett's sentence hit like a seismic crack in the dam. Because she didn't accuse him outright. She didn't invoke criminal codes. She simply reframed his entire performance. The suit, the title, the rehearsed smirks, the evasive language. She exposed it for what it was, a rebranding of betrayal as loyalty. And the room knew it. The chairman of the committee, a veteran legislator with a reputation for procedural neutrality, leaned forward as if to intervene, then thought better of it. He sensed, perhaps, that this wasn't just a rhetorical blow. It was a cultural one, the kind that resonates in campaign ads, in town halls, In classrooms where civics teachers are trying to explain what the Constitution actually means. Across the country, the moment lit up social media. News anchors interrupted segments to quote the line. Hashtags bloomed. Conservative pundits sputtered on primetime, demanding an apology. But the truth was harder to spin than expected, because Crockett hadn't made a wild accusation. She had made a moral observation, and even those who disagreed with her politics were left grappling with the clarity of her phrasing. Treason wrapped in a press release. It spoke to something deeper than Patel himself. It spoke to a national ache, to the feeling that the institutions built to protect us had been weaponized against us. That justice had been turned into theater. That truth had been so massaged, so filtered through PR and media spin, that we no longer recognized it unless someone dared to call it what it was. And Jasmine Crockett had dared. But the blowback was immediate. Within hours, right-wing commentators labeled her a radical, a race-baiting extremist, a tool of the deep state. One Fox News host called for her censure. Another accused her of trying to start a civil war. But she didn't flinch. At a press conference that evening, Crockett stood before the cameras, calm and unshaken. "My job," she said, "is not to make Kash Patel comfortable. It's to make sure the American people know the truth. If that truth is uncomfortable, so be it." Behind her, a young staffer held up a copy of the hearing transcript, already being published online. The phrase was highlighted. And back inside the Capitol, something strange happened. A shift, subtle but real. Members of the committee who had been hesitant to push Patel too hard now began to lean in. Questions sharpened. Language changed. The standard decorum gave way to urgency. Because when one member finds the courage to say the quiet part out loud, it gives others permission to stop pretending. In the hours that followed, a new narrative began to emerge. Not just about Patel, but about the ecosystem that had enabled him. The former officials who had refused to testify. The agencies that had stonewalled. The talking heads who had recast insurrection as free speech. Crockett had lit the match. And now, the fire was spreading. But what happened next would test more than just the committee's resolve. It would test the country's. Because buried in Crockett's files was a piece of evidence that would shift the stakes entirely. A document no one outside a small circle had yet seen. One that connected Patel to something far more damning than political theater. It hadn't been introduced yet, but it would be. And when it was, it wouldn't just challenge Patel's credibility. It would change the entire timeline of January 6th. You could almost hear the paper tremble as Jasmine Crockett picked it up. It wasn't the sound of nervous hands. Hers were steady, but the collective anticipation vibrating through the room like a low hum. Committee hearings rarely carry this kind of tension past the 5 o'clock news cycle. They're often orchestrated spectacles, more performance than pursuit. But on this day, something real was happening. Something unscripted. And now, Crockett was holding the reason. A document. Unclassified. Recently unclassified, in fact, just 36 hours before the hearing. It had moved like a ghost through Capitol corridors for months. Referenced but unseen, whispered about but never confirmed. It had come from deep inside the Department of Defense's internal communications archive. Pulled from a string of encrypted logs reviewed during a bipartisan audit into the Pentagon's handling of January 6th. And on it, an internal memo timestamped January 4th, 2021, 8:03 p.m. Subject line: Contingency Planning, Domestic Event Disruption. From Kash Patel to Acting Secretary of Defense, Director of Special Operations, Legal Counsel for the DoD. The memo was brief, barely a page, but its implications were immense, because within it was a phrase so dry, so bureaucratic, that it might have been missed by any intern filing paperwork in a secured office. But Crockett hadn't missed it. Recommend positioning quick response units at standby. In coordination with the White House request, should expected unrest occur in the National Capital Region following scheduled proceedings. The White House request, expected unrest, and a contingency plan, written 2 days before the Capitol was stormed. The room, already stiff with tension, fell utterly still as Crockett began reading. Patel's eyes scanned the page as she spoke, as if hoping the words had somehow rearranged themselves since he last saw them. They hadn't. Every phrase was intact, every timestamp preserved, every forward recipient accounted for. She lowered the paper. "Mr. Patel," she said slowly, "you testified under oath that you had no advanced knowledge of any potential violence on January 6th, that the Department of Defense was reacting to what occurred. Would you like to explain why your office was preparing for unrest 2 days prior, and citing a White House directive?" You could practically hear the grip of his defense unravel. "I believe that memo was a general precaution," he replied, clearing his throat. "There were concerns about counter-protests, demonstrations. We had no specific intelligence about an attack." Crockett tilted her head. "But the memo doesn't mention demonstrations. It says expected unrest. It says in coordination with the White House. And it outlines quick response positioning." "Who, Mr. Patel, gave the order to draft this plan?" His lips parted, but no words followed. This was the moment when a well-rehearsed political operative met the edge of his script. Because if he said the White House had issued the directive, he risked pulling Trump into the crosshairs, something even the most hardened loyalists had tried to avoid under oath. If he said he had acted independently, he risked admitting that the Pentagon had anticipated violence and yet delayed deployment once the real threat materialized. Either answer would trigger further inquiry, legal, political, historical. But Crockett wasn't finished. She laid a second page beside the first. This was obtained through a FOIA request by investigative journalists. It's a security log from Joint Base Andrews. It records the activation of contingency teams on January 5th at 7:14 p.m., 19 hours before the first barricades were breached. Again, initiated by your office. She leaned forward, her voice firm but not raised. "Mr. Patel, this nation has been told, repeatedly, that no one saw January 6th coming, that the storming of the Capitol was a spontaneous act of political rage. But these documents suggest otherwise. They suggest you were not only aware that unrest was coming, you were preparing for it in concert with the White House. And then, when it arrived, you stood down. The room held its breath. It was no longer a matter of political opinion. This wasn't a tweet. This wasn't spin. It was a paper trail, legal, time-stamped, verifiable. And Patel, who had smirked through hours of questions, now looked like a man at the edge of a cliff. He opened his mouth again, this time slower. "There were multiple communications. I can't speak to every memo drafted under my name without context. We received a wide range of speculative scenarios from various agencies. Any responsible officeholder would." Crockett cut him off. "The American people don't need speculation. They need the truth. What were you preparing for? And why did you bury that preparation once the Capitol was under attack?" He blinked. It was a rare moment in Washington. A public official with power cornered not by ideology, but by reality. In the gallery behind the committee dais, several reporters had begun typing feverishly. Phones buzzed as headlines drafted themselves in real time. On cable news, anchors interrupted scheduled programming to go live to the feed. Across social media, the hashtag Crockett Files began trending within minutes. But the hearing wasn't over. One of the Republican committee members raised a procedural objection, demanding time to review the authenticity of the documents. Another accused Crockett of grandstanding and dragging this committee into conspiracy theory territory. She didn't flinch. "These documents are verified," she said, "and they're only the beginning. If my colleagues would rather look away, that's their choice. But this committee exists to investigate the truth, not coddle the politically powerful." And that's what was happening now. Not just a takedown of one man's evasions, but the slow, deliberate peeling back of an entire narrative scaffold. For years, Americans have been told that January 6th was an aberration, a fluke, a failure of imagination. But what Crockett was exposing was something far more disturbing. That key players had seen the danger coming, had quietly prepared for it behind closed doors, and then, in the crucial hours when the country needed protection the most, had done nothing. Or worse, had done exactly what they intended to do. Crockett didn't say that out loud. She didn't have to. The implication hung over the hearing like fog. Still, there were more questions to ask, more documents to review, and more truth to unearth. But before the committee recessed, Crockett spoke one final time. "To the people watching," she said, looking directly into the camera, "this isn't about left or right. This is about what happens when truth is optional, when power replaces principle. This is about a man who helped plan for chaos and then denied it while the Capitol bled. And it's about whether our democracy can survive another lie that deep." With that, the gavel came down. The hearing was adjourned. But the reckoning was just beginning, because the document Crockett had introduced wasn't just damning. It was a thread. And she had more. A second memo. A third. A chain of communications so carefully buried that only months of legal maneuvering had unearthed them. And now, she planned to reveal them, one by one. On live television, the backlash came fast, and from all directions. Within 24 hours of Jasmine Crockett presenting the Patel memo, the House Oversight Committee's inbox was flooded. Conservative think tanks called it a partisan ambush. National Review ran an op-ed titled "Crockett's Conspiracy, the left's new weapon against dissent." Fox News ran her clip on repeat for 6 hours straight, but with selective edits, of course, conveniently cutting the moments where Patel stammered beneath the weight of his own signature. But the most telling response came not from the press, but from Capitol Hill itself. By midday the next day, a resolution had been quietly drafted, one that called for a formal censure of Representative Jasmine Crockett for conduct unbecoming of a member of Congress, citing her reckless dissemination of sensitive material and disrespectful rhetoric. The language was vague by design, but the target was clear. They were coming for her. Crockett knew at the moment she saw the draft leak online. It didn't surprise her. It confirmed what she already understood. That speaking uncomfortable truths wasn't just controversial, it was dangerous. Especially when those truths pulled at the threads of carefully protected narratives. But what the censure effort underestimated was something fundamental to Crockett's character. Something that had defined her life long before she ever walked the halls of Congress. She didn't scare easy. Born and raised in Dallas, she was the daughter of public school educators who had taught her early that speaking up was never optional when injustice was the alternative. She had made her name in courtrooms where she defended clients the world had already dismissed. Young black men written off before trial, women criminalized for surviving abuse, families crushed under generational neglect. She'd been threatened before. She'd been followed. She'd been told to sit down and pick her battles. She never did. And she wasn't about to start now. Still, she wasn't naive. She understood the stakes were higher than ever. And the retaliation wasn't just political theater. It was calculated. It was about sending a message to others. Step out of line, and we'll make you pay. But Crockett had something else now. Something her critics couldn't suppress with spin. Momentum. The documents she'd introduced had sparked a media firestorm, but they'd also ignited a hunger for more. Editorial boards that had previously stayed neutral began calling for further investigation. polls showed a surge in public demand for transparency around Patel's communications and the Pentagon's true knowledge before January 6th. Even some center-right commentators admitted grudgingly that the questions Crockett had raised were worthy of serious follow-up. And then came the leak. Late Friday evening, The Intercept dropped an explosive report. A second memo, this one dated January 5, 2021, 2:17 p.m., written by a senior Defense Department official and explicitly referencing a White House directive to delay authorization of rapid deployment units in the event of unrest near Capitol Hill, pending POTUS confirmation. The source? Anonymous, but confirmed to be a member of the internal legal review team at the DoD. Crockett hadn't released this one, but the implication was clear. Her work had opened the floodgates. Patel was no longer just a controversial witness. He was the potential linchpin in a widening circle of deliberate inaction. The next morning, Crockett arrived at her office to find a message taped to her door. A photocopied article from a fringe blog accusing her of deep state sedition, with the words Traitor BTCH asterisk scrawled across the front in red Sharpie. Her staff called Capitol Police. The threat wasn't credible, but it wasn't meaningless either. It was part of a pattern, the kind of intimidation that seeks to make outspoken women, especially women of color, second-guess their strength. But Crockett didn't remove the note. She left it taped to the wall, beside the framed picture of her first bar license. A reminder of why she was there. At noon, the House Ethics Committee informed her that the censure vote was moving forward. Behind closed doors, a senior Democratic whip advised her to soften the rhetoric before the vote. Another colleague told her to focus on deliverables instead of fanning the flames. But Crockett knew the real reason behind the discomfort. Her courage had made them uncomfortable too. They hadn't expected her to keep going. But she was just getting started. That evening, she did what few had expected. She walked into a CNN studio and read aloud the new memo from the Intercept article. Word for word. "The American people deserve to know," she said, looking directly into the camera. "This isn't about revenge. It's about truth. It's about whether our military was ordered to stand down while domestic terrorists hunted elected officials in the Capitol." The clip went viral before she left the building. The next day, the Committee on Armed Services issued a subpoena request for Patel's full communications between January 3rd and January 7th. And by Sunday, Politico reported that senior White House advisors from the Trump era were exploring legal avenues to block any further public release of internal memos. But they were too late. The floodgates weren't just open, they had collapsed. By Monday, a third document surfaced, a redacted message from a National Guard liaison, noting an unusual delay in deployment approval, citing White House hesitation due to optics concerns. Optics, that word, so sterile, so clinical, was a gut punch to millions, because while those in power debated optics, a police officer had been beaten with an American flag. A veteran had been trampled in a stairwell. Lawmakers had huddled behind barricaded doors, listening to rioters chant for executions. Optics, Crockett tweeted the document, along with a single caption. "The truth isn't partisan. It's just inconvenient to power." By Tuesday morning, the House chamber was packed for the censure vote. She arrived early, dressed in all white. An homage, she said later, to the women who came before her and dared to be loud in rooms not made for them. The vote was tense, the lines drawn not cleanly down party, but through it. 11 Democrats crossed over to vote against her. 7 Republicans abstained. 1, surprisingly, voted against the censure. But in the end, the resolution failed by just 3 votes. The gallery erupted in a rare moment of applause. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply rose from her seat, crossed her hands on the desk before her, and said into the microphone, "I will not apologize for exposing the truth. And if you censure me again, I'll still be here tomorrow, with more documents, more questions, and more courage than ever. The moment made national headlines. But what it triggered behind the scenes was even more significant. Because now, sources were coming to her directly. Quiet staffers, former DoD analysts, whistleblowers with encrypted drives. What had begun as a single question had become a movement. Not centered on Crockett, but channeled through her. A reckoning not just with January 6th, but with every institutional betrayal that led up to it, and every attempt to bury the aftermath. But Crockett knew something else too, that the pushback would intensify, that her name would be smeared harder, that the threats would grow louder, that the machine she had disrupted would find new ways to try and grind her down. And that's exactly what happened next. Because in less than 48 hours, someone leaked her private security file to the press, hoping to discredit her. They thought it would silence her. That was the point of the leak. Not justice, not oversight, not accountability, just punishment. 2 days after Jasmine Crockett stared down a censure vote and won, a PDF began circulating in encrypted group chats among select Hill reporters and political operatives. Within hours, a sanitized version hit the front page of a right-wing blog. Crockett's secret file. What the Texas congresswoman didn't want you to see. The document wasn't just invasive, it was calculated. A mixture of real data and distorted framing, allegedly from her House security file. Inside, vague insinuations of radical affiliations from her college days, a photograph of her attending a Black Lives Matter protest in Dallas, where a scuffle had broken out blocks away, and references to old client case files from her time as a public defender, spun to suggest she defended known gang members and radical agitators. In other words, the same playbook used for decades to discredit black women who dared speak truth to power. And this time, they were playing for keeps. The smear campaign exploded within hours. Primetime segments ran cheer-in banners like, "Is Jasmine Crockett too extreme for Congress?" Anonymous Twitter accounts began posting manipulated clips. Even mainstream journalists, those who'd praised her only days earlier, began hedging, asking whether she had gone too far or lost focus from the committee's scope. But something unexpected happened. The American people, at least many of them, didn't buy it. Within hours, the hashtag #StandWithCrockett began trending. Her original sentence, treason wrapped in a press release, was now printed on t-shirts, handmade signs, pinned to protest jackets and rally tables outside union halls and colleges from Pennsylvania to Portland. Even more remarkable, a coalition of retired military officers, several of them conservatives, released a public letter not only defending her right to speak, but demanding a full congressional inquiry into Kash Patel's actions and the unusual delays documented by her committee. But Crockett, for all her strength, wasn't untouched by the smear. She didn't show it in public, but in the quiet of her office that evening, door closed, lights dimmed, she took a long look at the printed-out PDF someone had slipped into her inbox with a subject line. "They'll never stop." She believed that. But she also knew the fight was no longer about her. It was about whether a single sentence, backed by evidence, spoken without fear, could pierce through the static and pull a nation back to its conscience. The next morning, she accepted a last-minute invitation from MSNBC's The Readout. They offered her a full segment, live unedited. She didn't hesitate. And that's when it happened. The moment no one could have scripted, no producer could have packaged, no opposition campaign could have foreseen. Jasmine Crockett, live on national television, sat across from Joy Reid. And with millions watching, she didn't defend herself. She defended the truth. Joy opened gently. "Congresswoman, the backlash has been fierce. You've been called un-American, accused of being reckless. Some say you've gone too far. What do you say to those critics?" Crockett didn't blink. "I didn't run for office to protect feelings," she said. I ran because I watched too many people in power play with the truth like it was negotiable. We don't get to heal as a country by pretending that trauma never happened. And we sure as hell don't get accountability by staying polite about treason. Reed leaned forward. What about the leak? The file? Some say it paints you as too radical to lead. Crockett paused. Just a breath. I won't apologize for marching for Black lives. I won't apologize for defending my clients in court. And I won't apologize for asking why a man like Kash Patel was planning for unrest 2 days before January 6th, and then lying about it under oath. She turned to the camera. Face calm, voice steady. And to those trying to smear me, I know exactly what you're doing. You want to make an example out of me, so the next woman who steps into power with a spine remembers the cost. But I didn't come here to blend in. I came here to call it out. If you're uncomfortable, good. That means the truth is finally getting through. It wasn't just a clapback. It was a declaration, and it reverberated far beyond cable television. The next day, for more members of Congress, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, signed a letter supporting the expansion of Crockett's inquiry. Over a dozen whistleblowers submitted tips to her office. The Oversight Committee announced an emergency closed-door session to review internal discrepancies in the January 6th operational chain. And then came the moment that would change everything. At 4:16 p.m. the following Friday, ProPublica dropped a bombshell. A trove of internal texts between Patel, 2 senior White House officials, and a media liaison, showing coordination on how to control the narrative post-6th, discussing talking points, downplaying troop delay concerns, and most damningly, referencing a timeline blackout strategy that aligned almost perfectly with the hours of National Guard in action. The texts were dated January 6, 2021, between 2:44 p.m. and 5:13 p.m., the precise window when Congress had been forced to evacuate under threat of mob violence. Crockett read the report in her office, her team silent around her. She didn't speak, just highlighted one line in particular. Let them scream for help. We're letting it breathe. Don't move till POTUS confirms. Let it breathe. She leaned back in her chair and whispered. It was never just incompetence. The next week, Patel's legal team filed a motion attempting to bar further congressional subpoenas. The motion was denied. Then came the news that Patel had temporarily withdrawn from public appearances, citing health concerns. But insiders confirmed he was preparing for a federal inquiry. Because Crockett's sentence hadn't just stunned a hearing room, it had blown open a wall of silence. It had forced the country to stop pretending January 6th was a moment. It was a strategy, orchestrated, obscured, rewritten in real time, and now unmasked. And it all started with one question, one sentence, one refusal to sit down. Weeks later, as Congress recessed for the summer, Crockett walked alone across the Capitol lawn. A young intern stopped her, nervous, fidgeting, holding a yellow legal pad full of notes. He asked, barely above a whisper, "How did you know it was the right moment to say it?" She looked up at the sky for a second, then back at him. When someone lies to your face, and they do it on your dime, in your house, with your country at stake, she said, there's never a wrong time to call it what it is. And with that, she walked into history. Not with rage, not with vengeance, but with a voice that couldn't be silenced. A voice that dared to say what no one else would. Treason wrapped in a press release. And this time, America didn't just hear her. It listened.